and a half ago, so I hope you will come soon. Official starting to the meeting. This is Geneva Cities Hub Geneva. Welcome you very warmly in the Villa Rigaud. This is Villa Rigaud, which is our home. So Villa Rigaud, the home of the Geneva Cities Hub, thanks to the local, regional, and federal Swiss governments. We have many of them. Thank you to all of them very, very warmly. And with this, I'm not moderating. I'm not doing anything. As I said, they're fed up with me because I just spoke for 2 hours at the Palais des Nations. So handling this to my very dear friends and our very special advisor, one of the sharpest UN experts I have ever met in my life, Virginia Brás Gomes from Portugal. She was, among many other things, chair of the chairs of all the human rights committees at the United Nations. And also in her free time, she was working for social inclusion work and other important topics in Portugal, which is a sort of champion in the EU. So Virginia, not to say more for you, just handling the moderation of this event in your hands. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kamelia, for your very, very kind words. Good afternoon to all of you, and welcome to the side event on local and regional participation in the UPR and the SDG process in relation to the right to adequate housing. It is my pleasure to be moderating this event that we hope will be an important step in carrying forward the discussion on the growing role of local and regional governments in making rights real on the ground for everyone, with a special focus today on the right to housing in livable cities. Our speakers will share with us their insights based on their long experience in dealing with these issues from different perspectives, and we hope all the participants will engage with them in a lively debate. I will now give the floor to Kamelia. She said she doesn't want to speak anymore, but she's in the program, so we'll have to say something. She's the co-director of the Geneva Cities Hub, a new neutral platform for fostering city diplomacy at the global level, and to Sara Hoeflich, Director of Learning of United Cities and Local Governments, a global network of cities and local, regional, and metropolitan governments and their associations. Kamelia?
Thank you, Virginia. And once again, I spoke too much, and I'm happy to reply to your informal questions after the meeting. I wish to pay tribute and to give the floor to Sara Hoeflich, who is our special guest. She is working with the UCLG, one word, obviously, of the UCLG, which is the United Cities and Local Governments, by far the biggest network of cities and city associations and local and regional authorities in the world. Sara, super happy to have you with us. Please have the floor. I spoke too much once again. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kamelia. Thank you very much, Virginia, and all the participants in the Villa Rigaud. It would be really nice to be there. The place looks awesome, and it's a pity we are here through distance, but fortunately we can be with you and contribute a little bit on our experience to this event. So I think in the UCLG, as you all may know us, I don't go into the detail, but of course, for us, I would like to give you a little bit of insight on the story of the SDG and the localizing process, because this could be inspiring to the UPR process we have in front of us. So we engaged, of course, in the global agenda in the SDG. The SDG is a very important umbrella to policy making at all levels. And the movement, what we call localization, has started, I think almost immediately after this. So the term is widely known and refers to the interrelation between local and territorial practice and territorial development in the global agenda, the SDG. So we can say we have two directions, because on one hand, of course, the SDG achievement, everybody knows it cannot be achieved without local and regional government's action, but also a local and regional government can show their activities, make themselves visible, and of course have a better alignment and articulation of local policies and show themselves as policymakers. So since some years with UN Habitat and UNDP, we have done several activities to improve the localization worldwide. So the first activities is what I'm responsible for is capacity building of local and regional government on localizing the SDG. So this means using the SDG for their practical policy making, reporting, align their cooperation, and become stronger as policymakers. So, and the other part is the reporting process of the SDG so that the local activities can be seen better. So here we have a first term, the VLR. This means a voluntary local review, which was very important because it was really a spontaneous engagement of several cities that wanted to report to the United Nations with their achievements, and they have worked in the beginning, of course, more vague, but every time more aligned to the SDG agenda. So this VLR process, we have been developing several guidelines now with UN Habitat, is a movement that is growing constantly. So in 2020, we had 20 VLRs. Now we have over 100. And we look into the future because we have many cities that really see this process of VLR is an exercise that not only reports and gives them global visibility, but also helps themselves to align better and structure better their agenda and to speak their own policy to their own actors on the SDG. So, however, the VLR process is only one piece of the whole architecture we need to see in the reporting. So one very important piece is, another very important piece are the VSR. So this means the voluntary subnational review, because here the local and regional government associations, they have the role to look at maybe sometimes more than 100 cities or their members, to look in the indicators, make them align them with the SDG, and look about and contribute the whole local level of a country. For example, if you can imagine in Germany, you have over 100 cities thinking about the SDG and thinking about the policy making. And finally, of course, improving the intergovernmental dialogue, because the SDG is an inspirational agenda for almost every policy and the intergovernmental relation. So behind each VSR, now we have 15, and we have 130 associations, so 15 is a very important number as well. And behind every VSR, there's a lot of dialogue, there's a lot of movement, and there are many, many, many cities engaged in the SDG. So if we look this experience of the SDG localization for other UN agendas or for other agendas, and in this case, the UPR, we can say, first, of course, if we deal with data and with indicators, we need to see that not all data and indicators are realistic to apply in local and regional government. So the data that are reliable, that need to be easy to find, and most of all, what was very important in the SDG agenda, the data need to be useful for the daily work of local governments and over the long term to be important internally. So in short, what is important if we want to engage local and regional government, we need to consider this bottom-up work and their own ideas on the data or on the tracks we want to undergo or the reviews. So if we look into the rights agenda, of course, we do not talk about localizing, we talk about transferring, because it's an agenda already centered in the human being. But of course, again, here the local and regional government can contribute enormously to the international reporting process, and to for the United Nations agencies, it is very important to consider them as actors and to give them a space that is heard. So, for example, if we look into housing, we all know, for example, many cities in Brazil, they continue an incredible commitment on the right to housing, on the human rights agenda, on the right to the cities. and maybe they do it completely independently from the national government. So what is important is to see them, to support them, and not to leave them alone or behind. And this would be a little bit our own experience. And of course, we are here to give you more feedback, but I hope this has been helpful for inspiration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I think it was interesting, and probably it will follow up from the dialogue, that this bottom-up approach and what you said about behind the subnational reviews, there being a lot of dialogue and a lot of movement. I think that's an important premise to be taken into account. I will now move on to our keynote speaker. It's Miloon Kothari, a longtime friend, but above all, a renowned human rights and social policy expert with extensive teaching and training experience on the United Nations human rights system and UPR. He's an architect by training. He graduated from the Pratt Institute of Columbia University and the Maharaja Sayajirao University. He's the founding member of the Working Group on Human Rights in India and the UN, one of the world's leading national coalitions on the UPR. He's also the president of UPR-Info. He has conducted training in numerous countries on the UPR with civil society organizations, UN agencies, national human rights institutions, governmental bodies, and diplomats. He was the first UN Special Rapporteur on adequate housing, and he regularly advises governments, agencies, and research organizations on international and national civil society organizations on the UN human rights system, UPR, as well as other human rights issues. Miloon, you have the floor.
Okay, thanks very much, Virginia, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to all the organizations that have put together this important event. Before I begin, I think it's important that let me just explain what the UPR is, because people are not very familiar. This is a peer review process that was started at the Human Rights Council in 2008. There was a feeling in the UN that we needed a peer review process where every UN member state would examine comprehensively the human rights record of all other UN member states. And this process now we are close to the third cycle of the UPR, and one of the facts that has, of course, emerged is that many people have participated: civil society groups, national human rights institutions, parliaments, academics, but so far local authorities, as we understand them, have not really engaged. So I think this is a very important event in that context. So I in the few minutes that I have, I thought that maybe the best thing that I could do was just pose some questions that we can then try to address in the discussion. So my overall question, I think, that we have to address very centrally is, why is there such sparse participation of local authorities in the UPR process? Why is it that we don't see more engagement? Why have cities not engaged? So one of the reasons that is very clear is that the UPR process is generally run by central governments. So it's governments at the central level, and they have not themselves in the process engaged with their own local authorities in form of consultation or seeking input into the reports that they are presenting to the UN Human Rights Council. The second reason is that organizations that at the international level represent the voices of local authorities. We heard from Sara from UCLG, Robert is here from UN Habitat, have also not engaged with the Universal Periodic Review process. And this is, so it's very good to see both the agencies here, and we are hoping that there will be a more robust engagement. The third reason I could think of is that issues that are at the heart of local authority work, health, housing, livelihood, water, sanitation, have not figured very prominently in the UPR. In fact, recent research has actually shown that in the 3 cycles so far, it's part of a larger, what can we say, larger problem with the UPR that economic, social, and cultural rights have not figured as prominently as civil and political rights. This is largely a fault of the Western governments. That's something else we need to examine. But the recent statistics show that if you combine all the cycles, only 36% of the recommendations that have come out of the UPR process are on economic, social, and cultural rights. And out of these, out of those, the top 3 are health, education, and labor. And the bottom, with less than 1%, we have housing, sanitation, right to food, and so on. So there's a large issue there that we need to address in terms of all the input going into the UPR, how we can increase that, and perhaps with a more active involvement of local authorities, this will happen. The other reason that is that what we call the stakeholders who are active in the UPR process, so let's say civil society, academics, national human rights institutions, UN country teams, which are very active in the UPR, have not really engaged with local authorities. And I think this is something that we need to identify at the national level. How can local authorities engage? The other reason that I could think of is the status of local authorities. It's not very clear what the status is. Are they governments? Are they not governments? Are they independent? And then the whole political issue comes in. It's often local authorities belong to a different political party than what is there at the central level. So there are issues. So where would they fit into the UPR process? That's something we need to really address. And the other reason is that, I mean, I've come across many mayors, heads of local authorities, who are not very keen on the human rights approach. So this also raises the question of, how can we explain, sort of a human rights education question, how can we explain to the mayors that engaging with the UPR process would be beneficial for them. The other reason could be, a local authority can very easily ask, so, okay, I will participate in the UPR, but what do I get out of it? I'm already busy with so many things. I'm now doing the VNR, all the different SDG work. What do I get out of it? So that's something that, again, is a question we have to answer, and we have to perhaps prepare, educational material, manuals, handbooks, and so on. So what can be done? I think that a very good way forward, I don't know if this will work, is we need some test cases. We need to convince some local authorities to prepare stakeholder reports and submit them to the UN. I don't quite know how the UN will respond. Perhaps Gianni, when you're speaking, you can reflect on that. So reports that are similar to the voluntary reports that are there for the SDG, or they could submit what are called midterm reports. So in the 4.5 year cycle, we now have this very active process of governments, civil society, national human rights institutions preparing midterm assessment reports of how is the country doing in implementing the UPR recommendations. And even if the local authority does not, prepare a stakeholder report, they could very easily say that midway through the process, how is the country doing, and what is the role that we are playing as well. And here I come back to that question of there's a need for human rights education. There's a need for, as I said, UCLG, UN Habitat, and others to also engage in that process. What else can be done? The other is the link to the SDGs. I think Sara mentioned that. In the UPR process now, we have very sophisticated tracking methodologies that have been prepared by civil society at the national and international level. OHCHR has done that. And more and more in the training work, we are when we are tracking implementation of the UPR recommendations, we are linking each recommendation to the relevant sustainable development goal. And I think that, and perhaps the data, Sara, that you were mentioning from the VLR and VSRs could be used for that. So we could, we could plug into that and engage, also engage the local authorities in that process. Also, there could be much more consultation. I think we need to ensure. So at the national level, we have civil society organizations, national alliances of having consultations. We have national human rights institutions and governments and UN country teams.
Is it the lunch prayer? Sorry for this. Yeah.
Well, we also have faith-based organizations.
But this is the beauty of the presidential meeting, please.
So I was saying we have all these very, very elaborate consultation processes going on. Civil society, national human rights institutions, governments, UN country teams. Many of the consultations are joint. And if we can ensure that local authorities are part of those consultations, that could be one way. We also have interministerial committees that have been set up by national governments, which has been a very positive outcome of the UPR process. And in some of those interministerial committees, we have participation of, other sectors, and it would be good to have local authorities, particularly national alliances of local authorities, which there are more and more. And then, of course, the stakeholder reports that are being prepared while we wait for local authorities to prepare their own or to contribute to the national government report. So the ones that are being prepared by civil society organizations and HRIs, the UN report that's being prepared by the UN country team, we have to make sure that the views of the local authorities are included. So just to essentially conclude, I think in this process, if we are to go forward, a great responsibility lies with UCLG, with UN Habitat, with the UNECE, and we are all there to help. And I'm very much looking forward to this process unfolding and us making some concrete progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miloon. I think you've raised a number of questions in substance, but also regarding the institutional setting, which I think is also important. And I'm sure Gianni will be able to contribute to that particular question. I will now open the floor to the discussants. I have 5 of you at this present time, and I'm not sure that I will have any more by the end, but just to play it safe, I think I would give you 5 minutes each. So to make room if anyone else crops up. All right. My first discussant is Nargiz Arupova. She's the program manager for UPR-Info since July 2017. She has worked extensively on international human rights, development, and rule of law. Prior to joining UPR-Info, she worked at the Geneva Center for Democratic Control of Armed Forces, where she contributed to the monitoring the capacity building of national human rights institutions and enhancing the good practices of parliamentary oversight of the security sector. Nargiz, you have your 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. As Miloon has said, universal periodic review is this unique mechanism that allows the participation of all stakeholders. I'm sure Gianni would agree with that. The way that UPR-Info, international NGO, has been operating is that we support all stakeholders, ranging from civil society, national human rights institutions, parliamentarians, media, academia, and also the governments to engage in this process. Recently, we have been conducting a research on the good practices of federal states in the UPR process. And we actually are launching the study this Friday. If anyone who wants to join, we will put a link in the chat box. When looking at the federal states, it is easier to break down the layers and to identify stakeholders. We have the federal government, the federated entities, and we have the municipalities and the local governments that are the third level of government, the smallest political units. That's how cities came across to our attention during this research. For the past year, the cities and towns have been increasingly active in voicing their rights and concerns on human rights matters. In many countries considered in this research, there were at least 9, local governments have created networks, unions, and launched initiatives on sharing good practices across the human rights matters. Obviously, I'm talking about federal governments, but this is something that is also applicable to unitary states and decentralized governments. Just to give you an example, in the USA, human rights are being mainstreamed into local administration through initiatives such as Bringing Human Rights Home. This initiative includes a coalition of cities that raise awareness on human rights matters. They have also working groups on reframing local issues into human rights issues and reporting on local compliance with human rights treaties through participatory governance. We also have some other examples of good practices that include South African Local Government Association and the Swiss Union Cities and Towns, since we are in Geneva. And as Miloon has mentioned, the submitting of UPR stakeholders report for cities, they actually have started doing this. We have some examples from the cities of New Orleans and Washington, D.C. that have submitted reports to the OHCHR in 2019. Whether it will be included in the OHCHR summary report is an entirely different discussion, but they have submitted it. And if such reports are submitted and then sent to UPR-Info, we can put them on our website. These reports can be used for other purposes, such as sharing them on different social media outlets and really raising awareness. They can also share them with different authorities in question to promote the human rights issues within the cities. Similarly to what the civil society organizations do, cities can conduct advocacy campaigns, but they can also use their unique structure to initiate consultations. And this is a niche for me. Consultations among themselves, consultation with central authorities, central governments, but also with any other stakeholders that they deem interesting for them. The more inclusive the consultations are, the better the process will be at the end, of course. So here it is a matter of coordination and of inclusion. Cities can also voice their willingness to be included in the national consultation process with the government. They can initiate consultations, but they can also voice the willingness to participate in national consultations with the central government when they're drafting their national reports. It is really important that their voice is heard when drafting the national report. Just to talk about the implementation, since we are at the beginning of, almost at the beginning of the 4th cycle of the UPR, it is really crucial that we talk about implementation. Cities are essential actors for the implementation, since they have this unique position of being operational units of governments at the local level. Some recommendations, when you look at all the recommendations received by a country, you can really identify some that are really linked to cities and that are easily implementable by the cities. They can really become the active implementing partner. They are really topics such as domestic violence, access to health, migration rights, and rights for adequate housing that are really at heart for the cities, and they can really contribute on the implementation level. I don't know if you recall, but during the COVID-19 lockdown, there was a rise of domestic violence, and we've seen on the social media, on YouTube and on Instagram, videos of women that would go to the pharmacies and use a code word to say that they have been under domestic violence. And this is something that cities can promote. Those are the awareness raising campaigns that they can really be part of. In sum, I would just say that the essential components for cities in the UPR process are consultations and coordination among themselves and among different stakeholders for the UPR. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nargiz. I think you raised a couple of issues. I'm particularly taken up by this issue of how cities became visible during the pandemic. And there are many good examples which I think could be useful in carrying this discussion further. It was just a matter of kind of pressing the button, and I think cities and local governments rose to the challenge. My third speaker is now Doris Andoni. Oh, hi, you're here.
Hello, yes.
Welcome. She's the head of the housing policy in the Ministry of Finance and Economy of Albania and the chair of the UNECE Committee on Urban Development, Housing and Land Management. She has worked as an architect for several years and a consultant in different international projects. You have the floor.
Thank you. And apologies for not being since the beginning in this parallel session, which is of great importance and interest for me as the chair of the committee, but also as director of housing at home. In this parallel session, I would like to highlight what is envisaged in the subject of this meeting. So how to make possible cooperation of local governments with national and international organizations with regard specifically to when it comes to housing, the right to housing. As it was mentioned, the right to housing is not recognized officially in the legislation of many countries. And therefore, even cities, they find it difficult to implement it as the right housing. However, there are policies in place to implement in a different ways right to housing, to make accessible housing at affordable and adequate standards. And this is very crucial for the achievements of 2030 agenda objectives and also for achieving the SDGs. In particular, SDG 11 is related directly with the role and functions of local governments. However, not all local governments have the financial means, know-how and human capacity to develop and address inclusiveness, safety, resilience and sustainability. And this also is very important if we go into details of the targets. For example, take target 11.1, ensure access for all to adequate, safe and affordable housing and basic services and upgrade slums. Housing is a function of local self-government. However, they cannot exercise this function if they are not supported. And in many cases, housing is considered as a shared responsibility. For example, in my country, housing is defined by legislation as the function of local self-government. However, it is executed as a shared responsibility where national governments support local governments to achieve common objectives. So there is a big gap between responsibilities with which local governments are allocated and the abilities and possibilities to implement this. And that's why it comes the need for support and cooperation at national level between local and national and regional authorities, and at the same time because even national governments in most in many cases, especially in countries in transition like Albania and other that are going through this process of transformation from centrally planned into market economy, even national governments, they are not fully able to develop policies that address these important topics. Therefore, there is also a need for international cooperation and exchange of information. I would say that at national level, there are methodologies and mechanisms already developed to implement this kind of cooperation between local and national governments and other stakeholders. When it comes to mechanisms and instruments for cooperation between local governments and international organizations, there is need for more attention. And why I say this? First, because local governments, despite being autonomous authorities, they act within a constitutional and legal frameworks of specific countries, of the country. They also operate within a national financial regulation system. They contribute to common objectives and targets at national level. So, entering directly in cooperation with local authority, bypassing national government, can create confusion inside the country. Secondly, international organizations, in particular with UN, these are political bodies that enter into a political agreement with national governments or take political decisions which are agreed formally according to diplomatic procedures. And entering directly in communication and cooperation with local governments may create conflicts inside. So I say this not because it is not possible to work directly with between international organizations and local governments, but that needs to establish more careful instruments and methods to develop such kind of cooperation. For example, this morning we heard by the representative of EIB, European Bank for Investments European Bank, that they can lend directly to local governments. Yes, they can, but this cannot be done out of the agreement with and out of control of national governments, let's say. Control perhaps is not the best word. But why? Because there is a legislation which allows local governments to borrow, and there are also control at what level these local governments, otherwise they can create big financial problems. So what we do at our committee to establish more institutionalized methods and ways of cooperation between international and local governments, international organizations and local governments. We are doing this through three main ways. First, by developing the guidelines for voluntary local reviews for the implementation of SDG 11. The guidelines highlight the need to coordinate with national governments. So, among other things, they highlight the need to coordinate with national governments. However, this is still only written. It's something else to implement and to see how we can do that. Secondly, by organizing the Forum of Mayors as part of the committee session. So we had the first committee Forum of Mayors last year in 2020. We gathered a number of mayors, vice mayors, and representatives of local governments, but within the umbrella of the committee. So within the umbrella of national representatives, and it was a forum that exchanged experiences, challenges, and the way they are dealing with that, but within the national governments, following up the problems that were highlighted. Third, by establishing Center of Excellence. The Center of Excellence for the implementation of Geneva UN Charter are established by countries, by non-governmental organizations, or by academia, and they support the implementation of the Geneva UN Charter on sustainable housing and support their government and also other stakeholders. For example, there are until now, 8 Center of Excellence established in different countries. And for example, in Albania is an NGO which is very much into urban issues, urban development and housing issues. And our aim is to establish also a network, national network of Center of Excellence that can contribute to this, and to engage also not only local governments, but also, as it was mentioned, different other stakeholders, which are a great number when it comes to housing and urban development issues. So this is what I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doris. Thank you also for raising some of the obstacles, potentially, that we need to discuss, but also you provided some good examples. I think it's a balanced kind of an approach that will certainly help us in furthering this discussion. My next speaker is Gianni Magazzeni. I don't have a very complete bio for you, Gianni, but I think you're sufficiently well known.
He's super well known.
To be able to forgive me for that. I know that you're presently, you were the chief of the UPR branch, and the UPR branch and UPR in itself has been extensively mentioned today. And previously, you were the chief of the America, Europe, and Central Asia branch, and you've also responsible for the coordination of the national human rights institutions. You've had a number of questions raised, particularly to you, so I would look forward to seeing what your potential contribution into answering those questions positively would be. You have the floor.
Thank you, Virginia, and thank you to Kamelia and Geneva Cities Hub for this invitation. I'm very pleased to be with you, and I hope to be able to answer some of the questions that I've raised and maybe raised a few more. I think that when it comes to the UPR, a great deal has been said, but I would like to underline a few more points. One, that it has 100% participation. So we have here a mechanism with universal participation so far. And this is very important, especially when you deal with human rights. The second point I would like to make is that it has a lot of high-level political attention at country level, with the ministers, senior ministers involved, in addition with process of consultation with the various state entities, national institutions, and civil society organizations. So the consultation process in the preparation of report, in the review, and what comes afterwards in terms of follow-up is extremely important. The third point I would like to raise is that of the recommendations made as part of the UPR, it's fundamental to take note of the fact that states do have 3.5 to 4 months to reflect on recommendations that they will support and those they will note. So supported recommendation, in our view, are an important entry point for engagement on multiple human rights fronts, in cooperation, at the request, with the support of the state concerned. And I think that the UPR has indeed opened up a great deal when it comes to improvement in the situation of human rights through increased ratification, strengthening national protection system, modifying laws and practices to be more in compliance with international standards, in also enhancing the protection of vulnerable groups and reducing possible discrimination against minorities and others at national level. Now, the third cycle is towards the end. We have reviewed 168 states. On the 1st of November, we will start the review of additional 14 states, which will take us to 182 states reviewed in the third cycle. I can say that recommendations are becoming sharper, more actionable, more time-bound, more specific than they've been before. And if I can zoom in on the question of housing, although Miloon has mentioned that we are at perhaps 1% of recommendation, let me say that there has been an increase in the number of recommendations from the first to the third cycle on issues that have to do with housing rights, housing policies, but also the critical question of protection against forced eviction or prevention of eviction. So even on those, we have seen an increase in the number of recommendations in the third cycle. And I think that through some of the offers that can be undertaken within the context that has already been highlighted by Sara and others, we can certainly expect much more. Now, to me, on the question of cities, my experience is positive. I know and I remember cities that have done action plans on human rights through discussion within their own establishment, a local level, and have taken the human rights agenda very seriously. Now, if we can leverage those positive energies a little bit more as part of the national efforts of implementation, which is the key aspect of the third cycle of the UPR, the implementation agenda, we will be adding here a number of very important partners in this human rights endeavors, which will bring in more effectively state, local authorities that, in my view, have a great deal to contribute. So I think that we as an office, OHCHR, have made available a number of tools to facilitate this implementation and follow-up. I would like here just to mention the matrix of thematically clustered recommendation country by country that we provide to everyone, and it's available on our webpage. I'm sharing with you links to those documentation where you can easily see what has been supported by the state. What can we as cities contribute to implementing those recommendations? And as part of the discussion today on the question of housing policies, housing rights, or protection against evictions. So I think that a great deal more can be done. And when it comes to the critical issue, how cities' contribution should come to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in the context of the UPR, I think that you have already said it. Those are authorities. Authorities should be part of the national report and not, in our view, UN compilation or the summary of stakeholder submissions, because as you well know, we have only limited words available, and we have hundreds and hundreds of NGOs contributing to those summaries. We have had the similar discussion on the question of members of parliament. Where should they fit in if they want to make a contribution? Well, political parties, members of parliament should channel their input through the national report, because they are not independent civil society organization, they are not national human rights institution, they are not the UN system. Although national entities, a civil society organization can certainly be alerted and in cooperation with cities and local authorities make sure that their views come through also their normal reporting through the UPR documentation. I would like to end by saying that I am very much encouraged by this initiative, and I hope that we can have a deepening of the discussion, taking into account the Secretary General call to action for human rights, the fact that everything that is done in implementing human rights is linked with the SDGs, and the matrix I referred to of UPR recommendation, each and every one of them is linked to a specific SDG as well as target and indicators. And therefore, in line with the SDGs and High Commissioner guidance, we're trying to get more of the development community to engage on human rights, and we hope that local authorities, cities, can also do their part effectively as part of the national efforts and as part of this global implementation agenda, which can only enhance prevention and increase the success of the SDGs and the Agenda 2030. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Gianni. I think what you said also brings us back into this discussion about coordination between the central and the local authorities and a mutual recognition of the mutually reinforcing role they can play. And that, I think, requires probably much more work to convince all the partners engaged that this is not an either-or situation, but that it's a complementary kind of contribution where everyone has a specific role to play. I think I have one of the speakers that was...
He's here. But
he's back?
Yeah, exactly.
And will he speak?
He will.
All right.
I can just say something.
Simone Giovetti, I'm not sure you have been told that you will speak, but that is the indication I have. And I also have one line about you, that you are with Cités, Unies. So I'll give you an extra minute if you want to say something more about yourself, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry, I was just cut my camera for a few minutes, but thank you for the invitation. I think that I will bring to the debate another angle. I'm not sure if it's completely fits with the purpose of this side event, but in any case, I think it's important to share it with you. Just first, Cités Unies France, United Cities of France, is a French network of local and regional authorities engaged on decentralized cooperation. And we are, of course, involved with the UCLG and particularly with the city of Geneva in a particular field that is has to see with the recovery, the role of local authorities in a recovery after a disaster. With the UCLG, we are, of course, and Sara just recall, involved on the national and the subnational review process. But as our organization is more focused on cooperation, we are a little bit far from the implementation of SDGs in France and in our local authorities. But we engaged recently a new process that is more around the SDGs 17, so partnership, and we try to develop a new era of city-to-city cooperation that take into account more deeply the SDGs and the implementation of the SDGs through the cooperation. So we started with the UCLG with a 6 months training session on SDGs and implementation of SDGs on the projects. And now we are actually trying to implement it with our members, with their partners. The advantage that we have and the larger network of the French local authorities have with their foreign partners around the world. So when we engage on this process, basically we are working on implementing SDGs in Europe, in France particularly, and the countries where we work. So we start with now with the Middle East and some African countries. So we are really, I say, more on the implementation side of the work. So when Sara says at the beginning, practice are key, and local authorities need to see the need. I mean the reason why they need to report. It's really important because in their practical daily basis life, they are confronted to the really concrete issue, and at the national level, they are facing on a daily basis issues that are related to SDGs, and with their decentralized cooperation also more and more. So they need to see this national review mechanism not like a burden, but like a something useful for them to use it and during their daily work. Coming back quickly on crisis part of the job that we are developing with Geneva city, that is a president of UCG working group on crisis management, and that we established 6-7 years ago in UCG, and is also co-pilot by Cités France. And speaking by housing and human rights, I want to say that are the two key elements. And housing, if you consider that after each crisis, the refugees and the displacement person is a major consequence of natural disaster or conflict. The question of housing is vital. So now I'm bringing this point that is another angle when you talk about the right of the people to have access to the house, because we are talking about a very specific category of person that is without house for crisis consequences. But we see that for those people that are the number is increasing around the world every year. The timing that they stay on these conditions, so without housing, is more and more long. So it's for us is a critical point we need to raise. And we are talking about, so concretely, when we try to develop projects around to support local authorities after a crisis, a lot of priorities coming from them is how to help to relocate and to give a house to those people. And now we have, when we are confronting to this request, we still have two words: the humanitarian words that is there in order to face the emergency with a very a concept of temporary housing, and we have the local authority that are more long-term vision, that are asking a more durable solutions. So we need to we are struggling now, and I'm ending with this point, to bring to the table this critical issue for this particular group of persons. When we are talking about recovery, we need to think in the long term, and for housing is a very important issue. And if we could succeed on bring everybody on the same vision, I think we could bring our contribution to a better solution for these people. So I'm stopping here, but please, if you have any question, I would be happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Simone. I think one of the issues you raised also echoes what Miloon said a little while ago about the role that national alliances of local government authorities can play when you speak of city cooperation, because under this national alliance, all cities cooperate among themselves, or should. Mm-hmm. So that's perhaps something that we could also look into further. I will now move on to Robert Lewis-Lettington. He is the chief of the Land, Housing and Shelter section of UN Habitat, that currently manages activities in more than 40 countries and includes flagship programs, the Participatory Slum Upgrading Program, the Global Housing Strategy, and the Global Land Tool Network. He was also the chief of the legislation unit of UN Habitat that supports interdisciplinary projects at country level in partnership with regional offices and external partners. Recent projects include Afghanistan, Bolivia, Haiti, Lesotho, Kenya, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. Robert, could you please provide us with some conclusions to this discussion also? I'll give you an extra 2 minutes. Thank you.
Can I throw you a challenge before you start, Robert? Sorry to interrupt like this. But we have the Philippine ambassador to the WTO with us. And when he arrived, he's just sitting there. When he arrived, he asked me, okay, is this meeting about human rights? I said, yes, a bit because of the UPR. And he said, but is this also SDG? I said, it's also SDG. And he said, but I'm on the video, so we discuss also economics and trade. Is it also about economics and trade? And I said, yes. And he hesitated a little bit. Then obviously I smiled and he entered and he's listening very carefully. So please address also this really cross-cutting discussion we have, because I think there's many people here are thinking, is it about, don't make us wait. Is it about human rights, housing, UPR, SDGs? How we connect all these dots?
You have
Thank you. That was my.
Yes, that was what I was about to say. I'll give you an extra 2 minutes.
2 years, 2 minutes, it won't make a difference. Well, okay. Working backwards a bit then. I mean, on that question of integration of issues and why we cut across the different disciplinary areas, I mean, I can only speak from my own experience and my own opinions on that. I can't necessarily speak as the institution here. But I think there are some basic things. I mean, first off, that connection between trade, investment, economy, and what we're talking about today. There is no country on earth, not even countries on the verge of collapse, where you cannot connect land, housing, and economy. I mean, they're just fundamentally linked. I think I may be misquoting, and I apologize if I am, but I think the approximate numbers that Saskia Sassen put out once were, I think, 60% of world assets consist of urban property. That's, an economy is made or broken by that kind of share. In wealthy economies, and I think Switzerland is a stunning example when you look at it, the proportion of GDP that is surrounded by land is massive. In some cases, in wealthy countries now, more than 50% of GDP figures are based on land values and speculation. That, I'm not putting that out as a good thing. There are a lot of points being made that this is extremely problematic because the financialization of land and housing is squeezing a lot of people out of the market. But that means that when you're talking about questions of land, housing and shelter, you are talking about the basic economic choices and decisions that the government makes. Both what the government makes will affect how those outcomes arrive for individuals, but similarly, government choices are shaped by the realities that are around them in these fields. So I think that finance and economy, and it is global, this is not a local thing. You know, it may be the niche headline of the day, but I was reading yesterday about these recent leaks about offshore investing and financial transactions.
Pandora.
Yeah, exactly. Look at the proportion of those that relate to property. Massive amounts. These things all interconnect. Now, for me, how that connects straight back into human rights is that's why we're to a degree, why we're talking about it in the first place. If you look at access to land, the use of land, in many societies still, that's a question of economic existence. Land is a basic function of production. If you don't have access to the use of land for some purpose, you're massively constrained in what you can do economically. And of course, the traditional element that appears everywhere of shelter is fundamental. If you can't put a roof over your head that is adequate, that creates a lot of knock-on effects. It may not be popular in a huge number of countries yet, but there is a growing view around housing first, saying if you have social and economic problems in a family or in a community, fix the housing situation first, then build your other solutions off housing as the central proposition. So it is a basic rights question. It's also a question of government delivery of its basic objectives and purpose. If you can't fix housing, you're not going to be able to fix anything else. And that connects also into security and safety and a number of other areas as well. Those who don't have adequate housing, don't have adequate social context, usually those areas and communities are associated with higher incidences of violence and crime and other things. I hope that sort of says something on the integration question. Going on, it struck me there's a huge number of points that were raised by all the speakers, and there's no way I can come at this but as a kind of summarizing approach. So I have to go off in another kind of direction. I don't know exactly what that direction gets called, but we'll see what it looks like. The first thing that strikes me is not so much that came out, something that came out strongly, but something that runs through what everybody is talking about, but often doesn't get said explicitly. The things that we're talking about that occupy cities, I think Miloon said it very clearly with his short list around health, education, housing, sanitation, some of these things. These are core basic issues. These are not new things we're trying to get on the table. We're not trying to change the debate. We're not trying to get people to commit to things that they haven't committed to before. These are things that at least since 1950 have been recognized as basic, bread and butter questions, that if citizens have these things, life is better. If they don't, life is worse. There's no big argument about that. And because they've been there so clearly and simply for so long, we frequently know what the targets are quite well as well. We know what we're trying to achieve. So there isn't a great deal of argument really around, what are the basic set of services that a house should have access to? What should an adequate house look like? That may vary country by country a bit and in climates and things, but we have a pretty good idea of what we're after. That should make this a lot easier than it is. It makes you wonder, well, why aren't we doing better at measuring this if we actually know what we're trying to do and we know how to measure it? So that's one of the reasons why I'm very interested in the UPR process, in that it is a way, we don't in the UN, where do we discuss these things? Yeah, they come up in the SDGs and the HLPF, but that's not particularly systematic. In the Habitat Assembly, which in theory is meant to be the policy forum for discussing urban issues, the most we get as substantive discussions are each session there is a theme discussion, and then it moves on. But it's not a hard-edged policy discussion of where are we, what are we doing, where do we need to go. So where do you go in the UN system for that? Really, the human rights forums at the moment are one of the principal forums for discussing these issues. Why? Because it goes back to, we mentioned in the earlier meeting this morning, this is core to the United Nations Charter and the purpose, that you cannot achieve peace and security in the world unless you have effective development and effective achievement of human rights. And housing, shelter, services are central to that. We will not get peace and security in the world if we don't get it. The human rights agenda is one of the fundamental pillars. And yes, governments will frequently say that they are not obliged to achieve the outcomes. You can't just drop houses and water pipes from the sky and expect it to all work. We accept that, there's no problem. But they are expected to be able to show what they are doing in respect, protect, fulfill. Are they making the efforts? Are they making the consistent progress that we would expect? Honestly, I look in my section, we start talking about numbers. So we look at SDG 11.1, the number of people with access to adequate housing, the number of people living in slums. The numbers that you see in most reports haven't changed in 20, 30 years. Come on, do any of us really believe numbers? It's X billion people. No, there's not enough being pushed on that. And I think the kind of accountability that can come through a UPR discussion can take that up a level. It won't fix everything, it's not a silver bullet, but it can help get the issues on the table, and it can help get governments feel like this is something we need to count and something we need to respond to. If they're counting it and responding to it, as was said by Miloon as well, there is senior attention. That means they have to care. Once you start caring, you get into a different discussion, and I think that can take us forward a long way. Particularly because, in our experience in Habitat, resources, yes, is a big challenge, always. But resources is not the only challenge. Frequently, political will is more of a challenge than resource availability. There are many, many cities, even in least developed countries in some cases, but certainly in developing countries, where we can point to the existence of the resources to fix some of these problems. The question is, how do we get them applied to the problem? If you look at one of the things that has intrigued me recently is the correlation between property values in a place and tax, the proportion to which property is taxed. In many, many countries, you have quite significant property values in urban areas, but some of the lowest taxation takes on property anywhere in the world, frequently less than 1%. So that's a huge untapped asset, because most people, I'm not trying to sort of say, you know, there should be state seizure or anything, but most people will agree that if you are taxing at less than 1% of the available value to provide services to support that value, you are probably underserving. It's a very low bar. So I think there's a lot that can be done, and that can be improved by getting open discussion and more comparison of what people are doing. I think that's you know, 2 more points. I don't know where I am on time. No. I apologise.
You are on time.
The first one, technical versus policy, comes up a lot. There's a lot of discussion around what should advice on policy be and where should we go versus what are the technical solutions. And this is very common within Habitat particularly. We have a lot of engineers, we have a lot of architects, and they're kind of, don't bother me with politics, that's complicated, I don't want to know. Just let me get on with building stuff. And I quite like that in a way, but at the same time, it's a complete illusion, because the standards for what you're going to build are a political question. What we ask people to do, the ability to give you the resources and the political space to do it, is a political question. You know, I think almost everything is political in some ways when you come down. The UPR has great potential to help connect that. So, for example, we see in the Human Rights Council, there are, in just the last 2 sessions, we've seen the Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing propose a new set of priorities for his mandate. We've seen the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment propose, I think it's 7 or a 9-point plan on water and sanitation. These affect the standards that people will be expected to implement. If it's a 7-point set of principles for water and sanitation, that will feed right down to cities in terms of what they're expected to deliver and how they're expected to do it. So connecting that with the UPR process in the same body is a way of affecting the standards, affecting the norms, and bringing steadily a manageable bar upwards and helping everybody learn. So connecting that technical and that policy side. A lot of relevance, and that's why we're trying in Habitat to engage more consistently in the Human Rights Council and in the UPR process. And then, you know, finally, really, I think another thing that came out a lot in most of the comments that came out is that there are lots of strands to this debate, and one of the big ones is that there is a difference between who is reporting and what is reported. And at the moment, we're still somewhere bouncing between the two, which is okay, because I think both matter, because obviously who does the reporting affects what is reported, because if you have the power, you report what interests you, you report it in a way that you like. But I think we need to make sure that we do look at both sides. So that question of looking, and I'm very glad to hear Gianni be optimistic about the reporting of ESCR rates. I think that's good to hear. So looking at how that spread of the rights comes forward and how that's reported will be important. And then also this question of continuing to look at who has the ability to report, who provides the information. And above all, you know, it's a bit like the thing of when I used to be an in-house counsel and I had to do a lot of negotiations, people would always come with percentages of things. You know, I've got an agreement of 20%. And you always kind of, well, that doesn't really matter. It's a question, 20% of what? You know, the starting point is what you're talking about. And think it's very important that we shift the debate here on these things as well. So we're looking at who does the analysis. It's not just the question of what is the information that puts forward, but who sets the frameworks, who does the analysis and draws the conclusions and creates the advice that says what should we do with this. And I think we've got to keep a close eye on that too. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Robert. Indeed.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I just want to make one brief comment before I open the floor to anyone who would like to participate. Is how heartened I am by this reference to economic, social, and cultural rights as being really one of the key fields in which I think the central and local authorities can come together. And if there was any doubt about this, I think the pandemic brought this very much to the forefront. The interdependence of rights on one hand, and the possibility of all levels of government, in fact, the potential for all levels of government to contribute in a way that is meaningful. That is indeed heartening. I will now open up the discussion to anyone who would like to participate and ask a question from the discussions, from our keynote speaker, from anyone else who would like to participate. We have around 15 minutes.
Virginia.
15 minutes, yes.
Yeah, so, sorry, Ambassador of Philippines just behind you. I will
Who was
help
the
you.
first?
Yes, please, Ambassador.
Ambassador, you have the floor, please.
Yeah.
Could you ask your question?
You can.
Yes. Now, I'll just do it from here. But thank you very much, because I really found this very interesting. I actually am from the WTO side, and so I had those very questions. What have we got to do with this? But what attracted me is the SDG monitoring process, because I'm currently chairing the Trade and Environment Committee, and we're monitoring at least 6 or 7 of the SDG goals, where the trade community can contribute greatly to achieving the leaders' mandate of the SDGs, and of course SDG 17 on partnership. So it was very interesting to hear how the last intervention, because it's really the integration question, and our first speaker was very clear that economic rights somehow fall far behind, and many developing countries in the WTO are emphasizing this economic rights of food security, housing, and sanitation, which actually in our Committee on Trade and Environment, many developing countries want to push this very basic economic right, which is also human right, of clean water, waste disposal, and these things. So I think that's what we're looking for, is how there will be coherence in the trade, investment, and human rights community, that how we can work together pursuant to SDG 17 on partnerships, how we can develop better indicators. And of course, we've heard of green indicators, but housing, indeed, as pointed out by the last speaker, and land, there are many theories of development that unleashing and enabling people to have small farms or their own home is a very big developmental, there's a triple ripple effects if this is enabled. That's why we're very interested in SDG 11 on sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Is someone else? Yes, please. I'm sorry, I don't like to turn. Could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, certainly. My name is Julie Wilson. I'm the lead author of the report Housing 2030, which will be discussed this afternoon. And it's also a report which contributed in a significant way.
Could you speak up, please?
Yes,
No, just speak up.
It contributed in the findings of that report, of each chapter on land tools and ways to improve or to realise the right to adequate housing. Those tools are defined and also shown how they're applied, and also research on the advantages and disadvantages of their use in different contexts. We try to understand their contexts, for example, in federal settings or in areas where there are weakly resourced local governments. It is, in a sense, a great source of information. But the actual conclusions or findings, the insights from that, form a good deal of that action plan. So the action plan, which is to be endorsed by governments on a following day, the Thursday, is certainly something which is about realising the rights to adequate housing. And in the fourth part of that action plan, you'll see the way we try to lay out and synthesise the human rights agenda, sustainable development goals, zeroing in on the various and individual goals of the sustainable development goals. Look at the way in which they can be applied to various scales, the home, the neighbourhood, the city, the nation, and not just to see it as an isolated entity of the home, but much broader, and that's why it's called, it's about place in the world, it's about the surroundings. So I just wanted to draw your attention to that important document. I saw it for the first time myself in printed form today, and it's really exciting. But one of the key authors is also in the room, it's Professor Holger Wolfgang, who made a big contribution to the environmental climate chapter, and who's left also Michelle Ross. One point which was picked up by Habitat was we shouldn't really just be talking about what COVID has revealed to us. It's also what it's shown that despite COVID, housing prices have become even more unaffordable in many countries. So the point that Todd is making about financialisation and the decoupling of incomes and ability of households to pay for their homes for all the investment that's going on in real estate and how that's been flowed and enabled into our housing systems. These are creations of policy. These are things that we can design differently. Michelle and I wrote a paper for the European Network Housing Conference.
Sorry, we just don't have time to listen to all this. I'm sorry, and also you are not heard from the people there. Could you probably provide with the website where we can?
Yeah, well, we could begin with housing2030.org.
Yeah,
that would be the best.
So we will publish.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations. Thank you so much.
Yeah. No,
I'm sorry.
Exactly.
I'm sorry it cannot be heard, but we have the link. Maybe you can put it up on the chat.
Yeah,
Thank you.
We put it on the chat.
Anyone else wanting to contribute or make a comment or ask a question? Also from those who are listening to us virtually?
Questions? Here, Virginia.
Yes, please.
Can I come back to where Graham left it in the sense of investment? Now, investment and finance. I'm also part of the UNECE PPP unit, the public-private partnership unit, and it's the most controversial, difficult item, but it's part of life, so to speak, especially in countries which are indebted. How to finance the SDGs and how to finance housing, as an example. And in this regard, I'd just like to draw everybody's attention to the fact that the indicator of 1717 is PPP, and the indicator is a tier 3 indicator, meaning it's useless. No methodology, no data. And we have now been 6 years in the SDG process. And unfortunately, it's still not a tier 2 or tier 1 indicator, so people could go and measure. And in the cities, people could discuss based on measurable facts. What's good, what's not so good about the PPPs. And this is unfortunate, it's not yet, hasn't progressed, and maybe the Geneva Center for Cities might make a contribution.
Find indicators.
To improve the indicator. It's a useless indicator. And unfortunately, the World Bank is in charge.
And this also we can fix it.
Of course.
Well, I'm glad to see Kamelia on such a positive note. Can I have any more contributions from the floor? Or from all of you listening to us?
Just quick one to know on the indicators issues. I mean, because this is a headache for me, because in my section,
you could say for us.
Yeah, well, we're my section is co-custodian for a couple of the indicators on perceptions of land tenure security. And we have this tier issue, which is just joyful. We were very happy when we got from tier 3 to tier 2 and like, wow, progress. But the problem being that to get from tier 2 to tier 1 really fundamentally requires a lot more engagement from the member states, because it's when we're moving into how often is the data being collected and how is it going to be reported on. And that, you know, for example, we reported on, almost embarrassed to say, we gave an intervention at an ECE meeting a few months ago on this. And it was within the ECE region on the perception of land tenure security indicator. If I remember, I think there were 6 countries that had reported out of 50 something. 6 had reported, 3 of them had reported on half of the indicator, but not the other half. The other 3 reported on the whole thing, but the data was 11 years old. And that was it. And you're kind of, if the point of these indicators is to inform policy, which is we then have to change the policy and make progress to get to 2030, we're out of time. So I think these things are important and to use them as a focus, but we're going to have to look more broadly as well.
Thank you. Miloon, you want to say something? Sorry.
Gianni was first.
Gianni, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Just very briefly, because this discussion is very rich and a number of issues have been touched. I just wanted to contribute one thought, which is if we want to be more successful in advancing on the SDGs, we have to break the wall of compartmentalization. I think that reviews, trade reviews in WTO, OECD, DAC reviews, the UPR reviews, insofar as we're talking about the same issues at country level, we should try to find a way to connect the dots and to make better use of already available development assistance and ODA. I give you an example. If a recommending state who is an OECD DAC member makes a recommendation, and that recommendation is accepted in the country where they have ODA, would you expect that the country concerned would receive some support also financially to implement the recommendation that has been accepted? I think that that is not happening regularly. There may be exception to the rules. And so I reiterate the fact that we need to open up and join connecting the dots when it comes to existing reviews from the trade side, development side, and the human rights side.
I would like to say on the concluding side, it was very interesting to see the relation between the need now for a better UPR reporting and the SDG. So looking from our side, from the city's view, I think the point that was said on the indicators and the lot of design on the tiers, which Robert stressed, we can see there was a learning process in the last years when, of course, indicators that were designed by the desks of some organization discussed, then later when we come to the reality, this was a big learning process itself. And for the human rights and for housing, the same process can be of inspiration. But one basic condition is to consider local government as actors. They have a say, they have a logic, they have ideas, they have experience. So I was a little bit worried when I saw that in the initial keynote, Miloon was worried how to engage. Why don't cities engage more? Why do not networks engage more? Networks engage, cities engage, but unless they are not listened, they are not understood, then we will be in two different worlds, and the worlds will not meet each other and inspire each other. That is why my last message is an invitation to all of you. We have tomorrow the World Forum on Human Rights and Cities in the city of Guangzhou. I shared the link. And of course, when we think from the lens, what is possible from the cities side of view, how they work, how is the housing policy designed, then of course we will also find better indicators. We will find a better way to follow up, and we can find a better way to cooperate, which I think is the final goal. So thank you very much, and so sorry that we could not listen to the last parts, the last inputs. I'm sure they were very, very conclusive. I will now share again the link to the World Forum tomorrow, and thank you very much on behalf of UCLG.
Thank you very much, Sara, and thank you all, to everyone who's been here in the room with us, to all of you who have been with us via Zoom. I think this was the beginning, perhaps the public beginning of this discussion that I hope will have many more contributions and will help us move forward. Thank you.
Thank you for the complexity of it.